All right. Good evening, everyone. David, I'll pass it to you.
Well, I'd like to introduce everyone to Mary Welz, which is a regional specialist with Southern Indiana Cooperative Invasives Management. She's the regional specialist for Morgan County, which I am part of the SICIM, and then she's also representing Monroe County. So several of you probably already know her from that. She holds a BS in biology from Indiana University, Bloomington, and studied plant pathology at the University of Georgia, Athens. She is an active member of her local SICIM in Monroe County, identify, reduce, and reduce invasive species, and spends most of her free time volunteering to help with invasive plant outreach and control locally, as well as managing invasive plants and landscaping with natives at home. She enjoys exploring natural areas with her husband and canine family member, doing illustration and graphic design, and learning more about native plants and the biodiversity they support. So let's everybody welcome Mary.
Welcome.
Thank you, David. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen if that sounds okay. And we'll go right into it. We don't have a big group, so if anybody wants me to stop and say, go back, or if you just have a question that pops up, feel free to let me know. You can put it in the chat or unmute yourself. Just make this fun and useful for everybody. You're gonna find out I really like native plants. All right. So this talk, I like to call it Landscape Alternatives. We're going to be talking about invasive plants to avoid and planting native for wildlife, because David talked a little bit about what I like to learn about native plants, but I also really like to learn about the biodiversity they support. So it's all connected. That's my theme for today. Let me minimize something real quick. Okay. So to tell you a little bit about myself, David mentioned I'm a regional specialist. I work for Southern Indiana Cooperative Invasives Management. We're a nonprofit coalition of organizations, agencies, governments, and citizen groups. Originally, we worked in Southern Indiana, so South Central INPAWS overlapped quite a bit with that. Or sorry, South Central Indiana Native Plant Society. However, at the end of 2017, we entered into a partnership, partially funded through the NRCS, to start an initiative statewide. And that is where I come in. So the Indiana Invasives Initiative is our statewide collaboration. We have 6 regional specialists and a project coordinator that is partially funded through our program, but is actually works with the Nature Conservancy in Indiana, and that's Dawn Slack. She's our fearless leader. So we're working to try to work with groups to manage invasive plants and raise awareness across the state. One of the main goals of our project is to start new SICIMs, that's SICIMA, in counties throughout Indiana. You're probably scratching your head if you haven't heard of this, and if you have, you are just kind of smiling to yourself. I'll tell you a little bit about SICIMs before we get into native plant alternatives. Our Indiana Invasives Initiative Regional Specialist Team, we all have a region of coverage. Mine is fairly centrally located. I'm that army green color, kind of an odd shape in central Indiana, going down into Monroe. I have a little bit smaller region than my counterparts because I'm also the communication specialist. So I do a lot of the website updates, some social media work, publications, etc. So I mentioned that term SICIM. Apologies if this is review, but it means Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. They are also known as cooperative weed management areas, but here on the east side of the United States, it became important to differentiate and make sure that we're talking about invasive species, not just weeds. And we're a partnership organization. Each one is a partnership organization formed locally with the goal of managing invasive species across types of land ownership, so public, private. So that's a Hamilton County Invasives Partnership, newly formed SISMA up in Hamilton County. And then this is our home county, SISMA, Monroe County, Identify and Reduce Invasive Species at a weed wrangle at Cascades Park this spring, which I couldn't attend, sadly. So where are those SISMAs in Indiana? Well, there's a lot, and more are getting established every day. The ones in blue on this map, as of March 2021, are all organized and established. They have names, they have logos, they have visions, goals, etc. The ones in orange are at the organizational stage, so they're working on it, but they're not fully organized. And the ones in green are raised their hands, but they're not quite there yet. And this is all of the logos of the SISMAs that exist. Some of them are actually, we do have SISMAs without logos, but most of them are represented here by their logo. And then within Southern Indiana, the region that South Central Indiana Native Plant Society takes up, these are the ones that have logos that are present within that region, including the Morgan County. They have their new logo based on their new name.
This one? Oh yeah.
Excuse me, can everyone please mute if they're not present, if they're not Mary or asking a question. But actually, as long as I've unmuted, may I jump in with a question?
Please.
This is exclusively plants, right? Plant species, not any animal species?
No, that's a good question. And SISMAs can actually focus in on animals if there's an issue, or even aquatic invasives. Some of the ones around the Great Lakes area, they do focus a lot on the watershed. And so invasive plants in the water are an issue, or other invasive organisms in the water. So it's not specific. Some of them are focused on, things like gypsy moth, or, the list goes on. So today we're going to talk about definitions to make sure we're all on the same page before we talk about invasive plants and some alternatives. We'll talk about invasive plants, how they spread, their impacts, and then the importance of native plants. And we'll go into the best part of this, which is invasive plants and landscaping, and those really amazing landscape alternatives or alternatives. And then I'll just give you a few options to learn more and get involved without going into too much detail. So what is a native species? It's a plant or animal or other type of organism that has evolved in a given place over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. Sorry, I don't usually read every slide verbatim, but that statement is just perfect. It's open-ended. It allows for very small ecological communities, very large ones, but the important thing is that each native species plays a role, it has a niche, and everything's connected and co-evolved. So we have the oak tree, the white oak, the keystone species of a lot of our ecosystems in Indiana. One of our silk moths, that's the Cecropia moth or the Polyphemus moth. I can't quite remember which, that caterpillar. And then we have a spicebush swallowtail on our native butterfly milkweed, a specialist ironweed bee that only raises its young on the nectar and pollen from ironweed plants. And a goldfinch perched on a beautiful blazing star, both of which are native. On the other side of that coin, an invasive species by our federal definition is first and foremost non-native, and it's also likely to cause some sort of harm upon introduction. So that harm can be economic or environmental, or it can also be harm to human, animal, or plant health. And it's usually not mutually exclusive. So there was garlic mustard, very almost done, blooming now and about to set seed. The devastating but small emerald ash borer, zebra mussels, I mentioned, aquatic invasives, and then silver carp, one of our Asian carp that are a concern in some waterways throughout the state. There's a lot of negative impacts of invasive species. A lot of these are not mutually exclusive. They overlap. They affect our environment, biodiversity. Talked about the human, animal, and the plant health. They impact our natural resources, including water quality, soil health, which leads to reduction in agricultural yields. They affect our energy efficiency, our recreation, our tourism, our cultural resources, infrastructure. Some of these plants even come up through infrastructure or can block roads. Some of them, because of that and other aspects, can affect our military and first responder state of readiness, public utilities, property values, and just our sense of place and cultural resources. By the numbers, invasive species are very underrealized. They are shown to be the second leading cause for loss of biodiversity for those rare, threatened, and endangered species, and also the second leading threat to our forests. Unfortunately, direct habitat loss due to human activities is primary in both of those cases. The United States Geological Survey estimates that the annual environmental, medical, and economic costs of invasive species are greater than the costs of all other natural disasters combined. So bottom line, invasive species equals natural disaster. And so this is kudzu, a photo of kudzu. It's actually not Indiana, thank goodness. But this is in Indiana, and it's not just the vine that ate the South. It's also coming in from the south part of Indiana and then from the Great Lakes region. And our biodiversity is at stake. Everything's on the line here because biodiversity includes us. We've seen the monarch population declines by 80% in the last 20 years. And that's doesn't even include the West Coast populations, which are in a more rapid decline. A study in 2019 is showing that our North American bird populations have declined 25% in a 50-year period. And that's really just at the beginning of climate change. So we can expect more declines at a higher rate. And then up to 1 million plant and animal species are facing extinction, many of them in just decades. So it's time to act, and we need to act responsibly. We need to use our big brains to stop this decline. So the monarch butterfly I've talked about, and then I just wanted to touch on Douglas Tallamy's research, where he's done a lot of research on insect and native plant relationships versus non-native or invasive plants. And just a reminder, our songbirds, we love them, and they can't raise their young for the most part on seeds. So, we can feed them on our bird feeders, but they need those caterpillars to raise their young. So 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars per brood of baby chickadees. And they have 2 broods a year. So without native plants, we don't have nice, juicy caterpillars for our baby songbirds. How do invasive species spread? There's a lot of ways, and unfortunately we brought them in, but now that they're here, sometimes they spread outside of our control. But they are a lot of escapes from our landscape plantings. Some of them are brought in intentionally or accidentally in seed mixes and soil materials. Some are promoted for various purposes, such as for our livestock or agriculture or erosion control or wildlife habitat, though they are poorly suited to those functions. Some of them even in dried plant arrangements. Oriental Bittersweet is one of those, devastating plant. Sometimes they're brought in on our boats if we don't clean them between bodies of water, or even aquarium stock if we dump it out. And then large equipment, vehicles, they spread them quite a bit. And the animals, people, on the soles of our feet or in the fur of our pets, and then birds and other wildlife. And then there's processes, natural processes, water, wind, weather. They can spread a lot of invasive species that way. And then just plants growing, spreading by vines and roots. However, the ones in red are the ones where we can actually be really proactive to halt or minimize those additional spreads or introductions. Did you know that of the 235 woody plant species that have escaped into our natural areas in North America, about 85% were introduced intentionally for the landscape trade? So that's ornamental and functional landscapes such as erosion control, and 14% for agriculture or forestry production. So we brought them here. So the right picture, you'll see the dreaded Calorie Pear, the white flowering ornamental pear that is all over our landscapes. I learned recently that it is the second most common plant in Bloomington as a street tree or landscape tree. So it's very sad to hear that. Looking forward to trying to figure out ways to get rid of that in our landscapes. And this is another planting of Calorie Pear. This one's in Bloomington, spreading along the road out next to our bus stop, creeping into our roadsides, and then taking over an entire forest area. And then I just want to touch on the rule that passed last year. We have the Indiana Terrestrial Plant Rule, where we're regulating 44 species from introductions. They were already here, so we didn't keep any of these out of the state by the time the rule passed. And unfortunately, 2 very invasive species that were on the original draft of the rule got removed due to impacts to the nursery trade, economic impacts, I should specify. So that's both Calorie Pear and Norway Maple, both highly invasive trees, but they're still currently legal. We're working on, with the DNR Division of Entomology and Plant Pathology, to hopefully incorporate those and other highly invasive species on future drafts or versions of this rule. Of the plants on the TPR, or Terrestrial Plant Rule, only about 20 to 22 were ever in the nursery trade, some of them not very recently. And just the ones we'll talk about today, I've highlighted in red. We have other plant regulations here in Indiana, terrestrial plant regulations, I should say, including purple loosestrife, kudzu, multiflora rose, marijuana. And I will be talking a little bit about loosestrife today, which is depicted here to the right. Before we begin, I would just like to remind everyone that weedy or aggressive does not necessarily mean a plant is invasive. Weed is a human term, so it's more the wrong plant for the wrong place for people. So upper right, we have Virginia creeper. It's a native vine. It clings around the ground and climbs up trees, has beautiful fall color, and produces fruits. So the foliage is enjoyed by many insects and the birds appreciate the fruits. And it has a really beautiful fall color. And then the bottom left, we have the common blue violet. Everybody's yard has these, or most everybody's yard, if you don't treat it with a herbicide of any or other lawn treatments. And interestingly enough, our native violets are a larval food host for our Fritillary butterflies. And this little guy is the caterpillar of the great Spangled Fritillary butterfly. And without beautiful blue violets, we don't have the adult of this caterpillar. So keep the violets when you can. And they are also there for early pollen and nectar sources for bees and other early pollinators. So why use native alternatives? And I'm gonna use this term again, AlterNATIVES. It's a little awkward, but I'll get used to it. So native plants or native alternatives have comparable features with our traditional native landscaping plants. Beautiful flowers, they can serve as ground cover. They provide fall or winter interest, privacy, structure, and some of them even have edible fruits or nuts if you can get to them before the wildlife can. And while there are some alternatives that include popular non-invasive or non-native plants, I just like to stress that it's important that we do want to try to plant native as much as possible. So while your peony may not be invasive, it's also not native. So things to consider. So our native plants we know will support our wildlife. They are adapted to grow in our region, and if they escape, there's really little or no concern because they're intended to be here. So let's get into it. I'm going to talk about these invasives and their alternatives by the various types of growth habit. So we'll start out for invasive ornamental grasses. The only grass we'll be talking about as far as the invasives go today is Chinese silvergrass. This is a genus that has both Miscanthus sinensis as well as the hybrid Miscanthus, giant Miscanthus. It's a tall ornamental grass, probably the most common ornamental grass in anyone's landscape. Has really plumy flower heads, lots of cultivars out there. Some of them are even variegated, but it can easily spread by rhizomes and by seed, especially if it's a straight species. And that's what that seed head looks like, especially in the winter. And if you live in Monroe County, it's quite prevalent, also up in Morgan County. It likes sunny areas. It's escaping on our roadsides quite a bit. The highway along 446, it's very prevalent on the way to the lake. And that's the current distribution map of reported infestations. It's more likely more widespread than that, but that's the reported escapes for this invasive. And I just want to give a shout out to, I think switchgrass would be the best Chinese silvergrass alternative. Very upright, very attractive, lots of cultivars if you're into that. And that foliage can even be used by birds and or mammals, and then is also a host plant for some of our skipper butterflies. And very attractive throughout the winter. It just can't say enough good things about switchgrass. We have a lot of other native gramanoids that are great for landscapes that form that clumping or tall grass that we're looking for. My top two, I would say, besides switchgrass, are little blue stem and prairie dropseed. They're a little bit shorter stature and very adaptable. On the taller side of that,
you just lost your sound, Mary.
Oh, you still can't hear me? Oh, okay.
I hear you fine.
Oh, okay.
Now
okay, am I back?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. Okay, so big blue stem Indian grass, those are taller grasses. So for areas where you can afford to have a taller grass. Bottlebrush grass is one of our wild rye that makes a nice little attractive texture and part shade. June grass is a shorter statured native, likes fairly dry, well-drained soils. And then on the other side of that are native sedges. There's usually a sedge for almost every growing condition. So I'll talk about sedges again when we get to ground covers, but an example of a great native clump forming sedge, as long as it's a little wet, but does well in the sun, is fox sedge. So now that we've talked about grasses, let's talk about some invasive forbs with showy flowers. Does anyone recognize this? It is in bloom all over the state right now. Well, I'll just go into it. This is Dame's Rocket, and a lot of people think it's native because it's in woodlands, but believe it or not, it is now restricted under that terrestrial plant rule. It has alternate lance-shaped leaves with toothed edges. That's versus opposite on our native phlox. We'll go into that in more detail. It has showy flowers that are blooming right now on various colors. Oops. I just want to stress 4 petals. It means it's in the mustard family. And it invades woodlands, woodland edges and open areas, and it spreads a lot by seed. So pretty awful. I realize it looks beautiful, but it's a no good plant. And this is the current distribution of this plant. It's probably in every county, but those are the current reports. On the other side of that coin, we have our native Phloxes, and they are just gorgeous. So bypass the Dame's Rocket and go straight for our native Phlox. The one that blooms early and is fairly short stature is the Woodland Flocks. It can be white to purple to pink. Just a beautiful plant, part shade, likes moist organic soils. And then we also have our tall Phlox, which looks a lot like the Dame's Rocket and growth habit, but it blooms a little bit later. So tall Phlox is not yet blooming, and its flowers are variable in color. The seed, this is from my garden, and the seed was collected wild from a roadside population, but most of them are turning up pink for me. And this one does well in part shade to full sun with a range of soil conditions, but not too dry. And we have some other plants that I threw up there as some good Dame's Rocket alternatives if you really love your Dame's Rocket and you're looking for something to replace it. Virginia bluebells are great because Dame's Rocket is ephemeral. Once it blooms, it kind of dies back, and Virginia bluebells have the same type of growth habit, same type of soil conditions, light conditions, and then they also kind of fade away when it gets too hot. Just starting to bloom now is a shorter statured bee balm known as Bradbury's Monarda, and that one likes part shade. If you're looking for some beautiful color that's just starting to bloom right now, it is the blue false indigo. It's not a very common native here in Indiana, but as a landscape plant, it is amazing. Brings in the bumblebees, and it's an early pollen and nectar source. Gorgeous plant. It's almost the size of a shrub when it gets going. And then on the other side of that is goat's beard. It likes the shade, but it's also a very large, beautiful plant, and that is blooming right around now. Downy skullcap blooms a little bit later, but it likes those same type of growing conditions, very popular with bees. And wild hyacinth, you can plant bulbs of that I believe in the fall, maybe the summer, I'm trying to remember. And then they'll come up. They're beautiful to see in natural areas. So I actually was able to get some bulbs and put those in my yard. So I have those coming up here. And then one that's blooming right now, it's a top native plant for landscaping, Blue Star, and beautiful flowers in the spring, really interesting foliage throughout the year. And then that foliage gets a really beautiful kind of salmon colored fall foliage color. And we have a few more native wildflowers for shade, and I wish I could cover them all, but I'm giving you some of my favorites. Hairy beard tongue is one of our penstemons that does well in dry shade. Fire pink, which is a somewhat ephemeral native related to royal catchfly, popular with hummingbirds, and blooming right around now. Jacob's ladder is a nice ground cover, but also blooms in the spring. It likes the soil a little bit moist. If you want a nice taller flower that's kind of early blooming for somewhat early blooming, I guess, midsummer, the fall sunflower is a really great plant, easy to grow. Wood poppy is still blooming out there in the woods now and makes a really nice landscape plant. And wild geranium, especially when planted in mass, is a really breathtaking addition to any garden in the shade. And then wild columbine blooming now. I have so many in my yard. I'm just waiting for the hummingbirds to come find them. So let's talk about purple loosestrife. And we mentioned this is regulated as well. It's a wetland invader. When this invades wetlands, not much else can grow. And it can even suppress the breeding of waterfowl and other animals that live in wetland areas. And it was accidentally introduced as a ship's ballast, and then people thought it was beautiful and continued to use it in landscapes. It has opposite lance-shaped leaves with these plumes of purple flowers that bloom in mid to late summer. And each plant can produce 1 million seeds. And they're very tiny seeds, so it's very hard to stop spreading those accidentally. And that's the current distribution map, though it's more than likely, I've seen it very commonly throughout the state. And so instead of purple loosestrife, I suggest we welcome rose milkweed or swamp milkweed into our landscapes. Really amazing plant. Even though it does like a little bit of a wet soil conditions, it does grow fairly well in regular moisture garden soil. It's a clump forming perennial. It's our milkweeds. They support the monarchs, but also other pollinators visit the flowers. And a good thing is that most of our milkweeds aren't really browsed by deer. So it's kind of an easy plant to add to our landscapes. And we get to watch the caterpillars that come and grow and form chrysalis. Oh, there's my sign. So other purple loosestrife alternatives, both of our lobelia, our native lobelia that are commonly used in landscapes are cardinal flower with that red flower, very popular with hummingbirds, and great blue lobelia. They both like moist, sunny to part sun soil conditions. The wild bergamot, which is the other bee balm that likes it a lot sunnier and can deal with nice moist soil as well as regular garden soil. Swamp rose mallow is a beautiful plant, especially if you have an area where it can have wet feet. Gorgeous flowers that are almost the size of dinner plates. Blazing stars, we have several here in our state, excellent landscape plants. Obedient plant, if you have an area where it can just kind of take over and do its thing, really amazing flowers that are popular with bees. Our beard tongues, I have calico beard tongue here, but foxglove beard tongue is another great plant that's an alternative to loosestrife, as is New England aster. It's going to provide that late season pollen and nectar for our pollinators. And then pickerel weed, if you've got a really wet site, that's a really fun one to have. So I just keep talking about these plants that like wet feet. So this one I just have to talk about because I see it being used in my neighborhood as a landscape plant. And it's not very easy to control. And a lot of people don't know to avoid it. So I like to point this out. So yellow iris or Iris pseudochorus is a wetland iris with yellow flowers. And it spreads by rhizomes. And once it's in a wetland area, it's so hard to get out. Most people don't even know what to do about it. So just keeping it out of our landscapes is important. It's not to be confused with our bearded iris or even because the bearded iris will have the lower lip of petals. It's just that upper lip of petals that they have. So please, please, please avoid yellow iris and instead use blue flag iris. It's a beautiful wetland plant, great for rain gardens. It's blooming now or soon to be blooming. And it's also a plant that you don't have to worry about deer browsing. A few other yellow iris alternatives are native goldenrods. There's a goldenrod for most site conditions, but Riddell's goldenrod is a really nice goldenrod if you have soils that are wet to medium. Cup plant is a great plant if you have the room for it to spread. It likes wet soils. Culver's root, I've been told it is a pretty nice landscape plant in regular soils, but it really does prefer those wetter soil conditions. Wild senna on the right is fairly adaptable. This plant, when it's in full bloom, you can just hear the bees. It's so full of pollinators, but it is a fairly large plant as well, as is cutleaf coneflower on the lower left. I threw in both Ohio spiderwort and sneezeweed. They both can deal with kind of moist situations, but are really great for just regular gardens. Sneezeweed is probably one of my top 5 native plants. It blooms in the fall and blooms late into the fall. So it really gives you a lot of color and interest up until frost. Even more great native wildflowers for landscaping. I could go on. This is not enough time to cover them all, but coneflower, purple coneflower is the easy introduction into native plants, as well as butterfly milkweed. Notting wild onion is a really fun one to add to your garden. Showy Black-Eyed Susan is a easy one. No maintenance, does tend to spread a little bit. One of my favorites is Aromatic Aster. It's not a very common plant in Indiana in our natural areas, but in a landscape setting, it's amazing. Mine bloomed until December last year, and it's done that for several years in a row. So amazing. Landsleaf Coreopsis is about to start blooming here. A great yellow spring flower. The goldfinches love the seeds. I keep talking about asters. Smooth blue aster is another great one for a landscape. Our mountain mints are excellent landscape choices. Wild petunia, it's a small statured native plant that pretty much blooms all summer. And then rattlesnake master, really interesting globe-like flower. Goodness, let's go faster. We've got prairie sundrops, wild quinine, really attractive plant. Compass plant, and on the other side of that is prairie dock. They're very large plants. They can get up to 15 feet tall, and their roots can get is equally deep. That hoary vervain is a really attractive native to add to your yard. That purple flower, midsummer. Our Joe Pye weeds, like hollow Joe Pye weed, gorgeous, big, beautiful plant. I'd say that showy goldenrod is probably the most landscape friendly goldenrod, very adaptable soil conditions. And then royal catchfly, if you want to attract the hummingbirds a little later in the season. And then I just want to emphasize that goldenrods, asters, this is data from Douglas Tallamy, we mentioned earlier, that he's showing insect relationships with our native plants. And so we can see our goldenrods and our asters and sunflowers are supporting a lot of different butterfly and moth species, not to mention other pollinators. Watching out for invasive ground covers and vines. And if you're in Monroe County, we've got a lot of those, and we need as many alternatives as we can find. So purple winter creeper, this is regulated. This is in Monroe County, this is our 2021 reduced 1 invasive species this year. So we're working on a few programs with that. But it's an evergreen woody vine. It climbs along the ground and then climbs up to produce flowers, fruits, and then those flowers and fruits are spread by birds. Very well distributed in our state, so it's elsewhere beyond Monroe County. English ivy is another really common ornamental ground cover. Evergreen as well, not as fast growing as winter creeper, but same type of growing habit. It grows along the ground, and it climbs up and then produces fruits, which are spread by birds. And very well distributed here in our state as far as escapes. And then periwinkle, or Vinca minor, also known as myrtle. It's actually a vine-like plant, but it's more of a forb that spreads by above ground stolons. And it has evergreen leaves, and it is unique in that it has smooth edges and produces these flowers in the spring. And it's, if you live in Brown County and in Yellowwood, it's just all over our forest out there. So it's a really devastating plant to allow to escape and very well spread throughout the state. So talking quickly, sedges make great ground covers. Just throwing a few out here: gray sedge, porcupine sedge, eastern star sedge, white sedge, seersucker sedge. The bristle leaf sedge is not native to Indiana, but I just really love this treatment that they have at a preserve in Missouri that I saw. And you can use white sedge or eastern star sedge to get a similar result. So I just thought that was really attractive. Our native ferns, this is not all of them, but just some of them: Christmas fern, lady fern, royal fern, the marginal wood fern, sensitive fern if you have an area that needs to be a little bit more wet, maidenhair fern likes really moist organic soils, and then cinnamon fern is one of my favorites just because it has those really interesting fertile and infertile fronds, and it's just a nice big leaf to add architecture to your garden. And then
Mary, if I may, on the fern.
Yes, let's go back.
A personal question.
Yes.
Some of those are spread more than others, right? So if we really are looking for a ground cover, as I mentioned to you, I'm looking to fill in an area where I'm pulling out garlic mustard in a shady spot. What ferns work best for filling in large vases? Because I know some of them don't spread very readily, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think Christmas fern, Christmas fern's very adaptable. I would say cinnamon fern is going to give you a lot of spread because it gets so big. You could also consider ostrich fern. It's not a very common native, but it's easy to find in the landscaping trade. Sensitive fern, if you've got a little bit of wet area, is a nice one.
Yeah.
I love that fern.
Okay. Thanks.
Yes, you're welcome. I'm glad I was able to help. So the most fun I have are the native wild flowers for the shade. Dwarf crested iris, early spring flower. It's done blooming now. Our wild stonecrop, which is in bloom, about to be done blooming, I'd say. Golden Alexanders, which are in flower now. Golden ragwort, which is still in flower, a personal favorite of mine. It's not just beautiful yellow flowers, but it's also leaves that kind of are safe evergreen to semi-evergreen all year round. So just a really nice plant to consider. Underappreciated. Blue mist flower has beautiful color, does like it a little bit wet. And then wild ginger, you can't beat that as far as a native shade garden goes. So add some wild ginger in with your ferns if you can. So we're going to talk about climbing vines, and then I need to speed it up, so I won't go into too much detail, but this is Sweet Autumn Clematis. It's fragrant, has leaves with smooth edges, and blooms in the fall. This is probably a little bit more widely distributed, but very aggressive vine. Another one that's used in landscaping quite a bit is our big leaf periwinkle. It's related to the small leaf periwinkle, but it's more of a trailing vine, often used in landscape planters, often variegated, but not always. It has a very similar flower. And I've seen this escaping in Indiana. So not as common, but we should probably pick something else for our landscapes. So Chinese and Japanese wisteria, they're very similar, very woody climbing vines, have compound leaves, very fuzzy flat seed pods as compared to our native, which has very smooth and round seed pods. And it blooms fairly early before full leaf out. And this is the full bloom right there. And these are the reports. It can spread quite a bit. It can take over acres of land, unfortunately. And why would you plant Chinese wisteria when you can have our beautiful American wisteria? It may not have as big of a flower, but it's meant to be here. And one way to tell that apart is that it also blooms after leaf out. So the American bittersweet is a nice alternative. We didn't talk about the Oriental bittersweet because I didn't have enough time, but just remember American bittersweet and make sure you have the right species if you're going to buy that one. We do have a native that's related to the clematis I talked about. Our native Virgin's Bower is equally beautiful. It just doesn't have that fragrance in the fall. Wild yam, moonseed vine, woolly Dutchman's pipevine, all really neat textures of leaves that work within a garden. The coral honeysuckle, a honeysuckle vine that's got a beautiful flower, but not fragrant like the Japanese honeysuckle, which is invasive and restricted. And then crossvine, it looks a lot like trumpet creeper, which is native but aggressive. So crossvine's an alternative if you want something that's not as aggressive. And some keystone flora notes on our vines. So the woolly pipevine supports the pipevine swallowtail butterfly. Greenbriers, not everybody loves greenbriers, but it supports a lot of wildlife. Even our poison ivy supports wildlife, and Virginia creeper. Poison ivy is native. The only animal that's deterred by it is us. So we're the only ones that have those reactions. So let's watch out for some invasive shrubs.
That should have said rough grouse instead of fuff.
Oh, thanks, David. Grouse. That was a typo. So that's a grouse that's it's very, I don't know if it's actually endangered, but it's in decline here in our state. So a So Japanese barberry is a very common invasive plant that's in everybody's landscapes. Fortunately, it is now regulated, but it is still very prevalent in the landscapes, and it is escaping into our woodlands. It's variegated, often green, sometimes red, depending on the cultivar. It has kind of spoon-shaped leaves and thorns, and then the berries, which the birds will end up spread. And this one is actually directly linked to high populations of black-legged tick. So if we have a heavy infestation, we're going to have more ticks and more potential for tick-borne illness such as Lyme disease. So big no on this one. And it's fairly common as an escape in our state. Winged burning bush. This is one plant that needs to be regulated, but it isn't. It is highly invasive. It's the most commonly used shrub in everybody's landscape. That fall color is the reason why everybody loves it. It's known as winged burning bush because it often has corky ridges or wings on the stem. And then it produces those fruits that are being spread by birds. So it is out there and it is bad. So break up with your burning bush. Privets. Privets are very commonly used in landscapes. We have one of them that's regulated. If you go further south, some of these other privets are even worse than the blunt-leaved privet or even the bush honeysuckle that we have here. They look a lot like a honeysuckle, and some people, when they look at them, they get confused. The leaves are very similar, but this one produces flowers and fruits at the end of the stem instead of all along the leaf axils. And it has black fruits that can persist over winter. And it forms big clumps, and we have a lot of it in our state. So I love shrubs. Shrubs are my new favorite. I used to be more of a perennial person, but let's talk about some native shrubs. Choke cherry can be considered a small tree or a large shrub. A red osier dogwood amongst the other native dogwood shrubs. Black haw viburnum is really a common viburnum here in southern Indiana. Nine bark, really landscape friendly shrub, not too big. And then indigo bush, likes a little bit of wet soils, but really interesting purplish flowers, great for bees and other pollinators. So a little later season blooming on these flowers, the smooth hydrangea, perfect plant for shade here in southern Indiana, blooms in full shade. And if you get the straight species, it'll be covered in pollinators. Swamp rose, along with our other native roses, really nice landscape friendly plants. Button bush, if you've got a little bit of a wet area, really unique flowers and persistent fruits. American elderberry flowers are gorgeous, as well as the fruits are edible, or you can use them to make syrups and the wildlife enjoy them. New Jersey tea is kind of a short statured native plant, likes full sun, really landscape friendly plant, pollinator magnet. And then lead plant, it's a subshrub. It's actually kind of a woody herbaceous plant, but really neat flowers for dry, sunny areas. Showy fruits, nannyberry viburnum, which is a little bit more common in the northern part of this state, but it can grow well here. American hazelnut, you can actually harvest those nuts once it's mature enough to produce them, and a really nice green, a great bush honeysuckle substitute in my opinion. Our native dogwoods, the gray dogwood or rough leaf dogwood, have white fruits. The rough leaf's a little bit more common in this part of the state, but it might be easier for you to find gray dogwood for sale. American plum can be considered a small tree or a large shrub. It's kind of a thicket forming plant. And the fruits can be tasty, but not always. Our native spice bush, a go-to plant for shade, especially in areas that has a lot of deer. Really good fruits for the birds. And then silky dogwood or blue fruited dogwood, not very common here, but really, it is an Indiana native and a nice landscape plant based on that fruit. And then fall color, and these aren't mutually exclusive. A lot of these plants have great fruit, great flowers, and great fall color. But fragrant sumac, one of my favorites for landscaping, and also produces fruits for birds. American witch hazel has beautiful yellow fall color. Winged sumac is a small tree, colony forming. So only for someone that has a lot of area where it can spread and do its own thing. And black chokeberry is probably the best burning bush substitute out there. Either that or the Arrowwood viburnum if it's a cultivar. And then our Winterberry holly. It's a deciduous holly, but it produces really attractive fruits that persist over winter. And this is in Monroe County, so you might recognize this area, but it's 8 acres solid Calorie Pear. So it's native. It's an ornamental pear that was native to Asia and introduced as a rootstock, and then people decided it looked pretty, and so we started landscaping with it. We introduced a lot of cultivars, and now we've got a problem. It also has really poor branching structure, and it's short-lived. So those fruits are getting spread by wildlife, unfortunately. And I think that map is underrepresented. Norway maple. It looks a lot like sugar maples, but it has a very uniform bark. The leaves are more palmately lobed than our sugar maples. And the seeds are kind of more like a coat hanger versus a horseshoe shaped for our sugar maples. And it is actually out competing sugar maples. It's a very shade tolerant tree in our natural areas. So it's in the northern part of the state most prevalently, but it's throughout the state. One way to tell it apart really easily, if it doesn't have seeds, is if you pull a leaf and squeeze the petiole of the leaf, you'll get a milky sap versus a clear sap. And last but not least, because we're in southern Indiana, is the Mimosa tree. It's a deciduous tree, multi-stemmed, it's fairly small, and it has those really cute flowers. They're adorable. I lived in Georgia, and I know how bad this plant can get. And we don't want this coming in. It just takes over roadsides, grows along waterways. It's a nitrogen fixer. It's really hard to get rid of once it's established. So it's here. We just need to keep it from getting worse. So I didn't put too many tree alternatives here, but some of my favorites are our serviceberry, including downy serviceberry. I love black gum trees, one of my favorites. Pagoda dogwood tree, it's a kind of a lateral branching dogwood with a compound flower. The flowering dogwood we're all familiar with. Our hawthorns, our Ohio buckeye, hop hornbeam, and eastern redbud are also great smaller statured native trees. So just looking again at that keystone flora, our plums, our crab apples, those are really great for our insects and other wildlife. And then oak. Best time to plant an oak? 20 years ago, second best time today. So we really need more oaks in our world. They're going to be great trees to have for climate change because of their drought tolerance. So consider an oak or a black cherry or a willow or a birch if you're planting a tree. And really quickly, go through some of our ways to learn more and get involved, not just with invasive plants, but natives. This is a group from Vigo County, our SICIM over there, Vigo Invasives Management. So we want to invite you to be a vigilant gardener. Many invasive plants were and are still sold, and a lot of them are mislabeled. So burning bush is still being sold, but winter creeper is illegal, but it can be hard to tell if it's winter creeper. So keep an eye out. Those variegations look a little bit different. And then making sure that you're using reputable sources of mulch and soil or soil amendments. And then don't just trust any seed packet you get. Make sure you know all the plants in that seed packet are safe to plant. I'm speaking to the choir, so I won't talk too much about Indiana Native Plant Society, but there's some really great books out there, including the works of Douglas Talamy and the Xerces Society, and an author that's an insect specialist and bee specialist, Heather Holm. So I really recommend some of these books. And then, you know, if you can, certify your yard so that you can celebrate all of your natives and then let other people know that you are planting natives, and so that they can be inspired to do the same. And you can learn more about Indiana invasive plants. We have a regulated guide that's print or PDF version. We have an Indiana Invasive Species Council, and within that council, an advisory committee that has a Facebook group with a lot of helpful resources there, as well as all of the SICIM website resources and social media. And through my program, you're invited to take advantage of our free direct assistance. So we provide surveys and management plans, or just very specific technical assistance. We can also help you with various invasive species resources and let you know if there's cost share programs that you can take advantage of if you qualify. And we can also provide project-specific native planting resources. Just a reminder, if you find invasive plants, get rid of them. You can get rid of a lot of them mechanically or manually, but sometimes chemical treatment is needed very responsibly. And then keep in mind that some invasive plant material should never be composted. So if you have questions about that, don't hesitate to ask. Some of my favorite tools of the trade. And I just love for everybody to volunteer to weed wrangle, because you can meet other people that are interested and actually learn something about identification and controlling invasives that you can bring home. So this website has a full list of all the weed wrangles that are going on throughout the state. And join your local SISMA. This website has a full list of all the SISMAs that are organized and need your help. And if you're not finding a SISMA in your county and you're interested, please get in touch. And thank you to Du Bois County. I realize they're probably not in the actual South Central Indiana Native Plant Society group, but I love these burning bushes that they have down there, or these billboards that they have down there. And it really cracks me up that right next door to the left is the hammer, and he really seems to support also breaking up your burning bush. So thank you. Oops, we don't want to talk about money more today.
Thank you.
Ooh, I went a little long, I apologize.
It was so interesting.
Did any questions pop up, or do I need to fact check something that I've put out there in the world?
Great, this was just great. I just want to tell you, it was just a wonderful presentation and very, very helpful.
Awesome.
I have an acre. I've been clearing of bush honeysuckle for several years, and of course, garlic mustard, lesser celandine, the whole shebang. And I've been trying to replace with things, and I've chosen some of the ones you suggested, but you have a lot of other wonderful suggestions. So it's just right on the mark for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I took copious notes, so I'm good to go. It's helpful.
There's a lot of plants I skipped, and I regretted, but we had to do what we could with the amount of time we had.
Mary, I think you made one comment that I think you might want to fact check.
Sure.
And that was the, let's see, Cardinal Flower and Fire Pink. I don't think those are necessarily closely related.
Oh, Cardinal Flower and Great Blue Lobelia.
Yes, those two are. Yes.
Yeah, so okay. I might have misspoke, but I meant to say Cardinal Flower and Great Blue Lobelia. They're both Lobelia. So one's Lobelia cardinalis and the other one's Lobelia syphilitica.
Yes.
Thank you, Mary. That was important to clarify.
And then I have a question. I'm an ecologist, and so I haven't traditionally gardened. And I bought a house about 1.5 years ago, and so I am replacing some of my grass with natives. So I've been purchasing them at different plant sales, and I bought some in the small narrow containers that are maybe 2 inches by 2 inches, and I put them in the ground, and they appear to just sit there. They're not really spreading. Is there something I should do? I was thinking that maybe I should repot some of them first to allow them to become larger root mass before I actually put them in the ground? Or do you have any recommendations on planting the natives?
Yeah. So for me, I've been doing like a getting rid of some turf every year. I spray a patch and maybe put down some cardboard too and cover it with a combination of soil and other amendments. Not always. Sometimes I just put mulch down. So I think mulch helps. I've also think maybe putting those in at the end, like toward the end of the season, but not too late, gives them, the winter to then they're there and in the spring, and then they can just launch. So it takes about 2 years to really get a plug planting established. And the closer you plant them, the better. So you're looking at 12 inches versus 18 inches. You could put them in pots, but that would be so much work. You might just try adding a little bit of mulch if you're going to do that method. I know it's not fun, but just for like a year or so, and then you can just mulch the edge once it's established. I'm just trying to think, you need to give those guys a fighting chance. But I think this is a good opportunity for anyone else that has experience with this, like Bill or even Joanna, who's joined us. She's with the City of Bloomington Parks and Recreation, and she is our city landscaper. So she would be a really great resource, because I know that she's used a lot of those 2-inch plugs. Sorry, Joanna, putting you on the spot.
No, no problem, Mary. Yeah, and I'd be happy to talk to you if you want. I can put my contact info in the chat, and we could talk tomorrow. We can email, whatever works for you.
Thank you. Yes, please put your email in the chat and I will contact you. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
But I feel like, if you need to, if time is of the essence, I think they might need a little bit of amendments. I know once they're established, they should be fine, but I think giving them a little head start doesn't hurt.
Yeah, and Mary, I a lot of the plant sales are in the spring. They've just been occurring the past month, and so I know you're recommending to plant them at the end of the summer, but they're sold now, So anyway, that's why I'm trying to get them in the ground before it gets hot and dry. And
yeah, and that's smart, because you don't want to take care of flats and flats of little 2-inch plugs, because that's work too. I just know from my personal experience, I actually worked for a nursery, so I wouldn't have time to do anything until the end of the year, and that's when I got mine in. And I didn't wait too late, because if it's about to freeze, then those plugs will get popped right out. So you just kind of wait until it starts cooling down just a tad. But that's for next year. I think just give them a 1.5 years to 2, and they'll be in there. I think it just needs a little bit of patience. Those 2-inch plants don't get as established as fast as larger containerized material.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mary, you had a question about property surveys in the chat.
Oh, I'm gonna stop sharing so I can look at my full screen. Thanks, David. Okay, so you have my contact information, so you can email me. Where are you at? It's Helen, right?
Heidi, I think.
Heidi, okay. And Heidi was in Ripley County, is that right? Yep. So my counterpart, I'm gonna give you her email address, and her phone number is on our website. It's Liz at SICIM.
Bartholomew County.
Oh, Bartholomew. Okay,
Yeah.
then that's Dawn. So I'll just put Dawn's contact here. Okay, for Bartholomew. And Dawn is the specialist there, but they actually do have a SISMA, and they're starting to do landowner surveys with their SISMA. Thank you, everybody. I know that it's hard to be inside when it's this beautiful out. So I'm really appreciative for the time that you've given